Everybody. So my name is Trevor Ivan. I'm your instructor for this session. Can everybody hear me? Can I get a little thumbs up in the chat? Everybody hear what's going on here? Okay, thank you very much. All right, so you guys feel free to participate, to ask questions as we go, and we'll kind of stream through some pretty important stuff here in the next 25 minutes or so, because there's a lot of stuff to cover. But I titled this session, Making the Pieces Fit, because you have a lot of information that's out there today. And you have to kind of come up with ways to process what's going on out there and how to present that to your audiences. So think about some ways, we have so many options available about how we tell stories today, whether that's in print, whether that's online, whether that's in broadcast, whether that's in photos. So just curious from you guys, which medium do you guys work with? So do you work with newspaper? Do you work with broadcast? Do you work with yearbooks? If you want to just drop a quick answer in the chat or unmute yourself and say out loud or however you feel. But what do you guys do? What kind of staffs are you on?
I'm on the yearbook staff.
Okay, excellent. We have a new answer. So we have a newspaper. Okay, so we got a little bit of a range here, and that's fine because what I'm going to tell you today is going to apply to everyone. You just have to find different ways in which to use it. So one of the things is everybody likes to do puzzles, right? Maybe, I don't know. So, but puzzles are something, we understand you don't see the whole picture until you put all the pieces together. And so there's some very important puzzle pieces that we need to look at about how you put your stories together, about how you organize information. So there's some puzzles we put together no matter what you're working on, no matter where your medium is. There's some puzzle pieces that make a really good story. So let's get started here. I'll share my screen and kind of we're going to start with this image here. So if I teach this session in person, when I go to a workshop, I go through all these different puzzle pieces and we actually make a puzzle and I hand people the pieces. And when you can actually gather with people, we put them in groups, we talk about all these, and then we come together and we put the puzzle together. So for instance, we take a look at what I think are these 8 pieces that go together that make any story good, that make any story useful to your readers. So I think we'll kind of go through these real fast here, but like for instance, like when I say your story needs a focus, what does that mean? What do you guys think? I think that's the most important puzzle piece. Where do we start there? If you need a focus, what do I mean by that?
I think it's just like how you're gonna wrap everything around that one, like main point.
Yeah, it needs, basically think of it almost like a thesis statement from, if you're thinking about it from English class or whatever. You need to have that central focus about what you're going to talk about. And especially when you look at things like, we want to do, students will do stories about big topics like depression or the economy or whatever. You need to break those big topics down and find a specific story. You also need to think about that when you're talking about a person. If you're writing a profile of someone, you need to think about, how do I, like, what specifically are we going to focus on about this person's life? If they're an athlete, for instance, did they overcome adversity, let's say, to get to where they are today? Have they suffered numerous injuries that they've had to deal with? Like, what specifically are you going to hone in on about that person that's interesting for your readers? So you need to focus. I'll just kind of briefly touch on the rest of these in the interest of time, but you need sources, like you need voices from people to be part of the story. We need to look at things like, your leads are very important. It's about how you how you grab readers' attention. You need quotes that go back to the idea about having good sources, about feedback and information. You need transitions to get us from one part to the next in the story. You need to attribute information. Your writing has to have good style. It has to have good flow. You also need, especially for your stories you're publishing, you need headlines. You need to think about how you draw readers in just with how you're presenting that information. So that's going to be stuff that you deal with no matter which medium you're working with. You need to think about those 8 things. So that's kind of the puzzle pieces that you've got to focus on with no matter what you're doing. However, when we go into the online environments, I think we end up with some additional puzzle pieces. We end up with some things that when we tell stories online, we need to think about how we make our stories a little bit deeper and richer. And this applies to you also in a yearbook. I was talking earlier in my session about, on a specific yearbook session I gave, I said, in the old days, I said yearbooks, they came out once a year, and you had one chance every year to reach your audience with a really spectacular product. Well, today you have the chance to reach your audience every day, because everybody's, or at least most of your audience is using social media, is using Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram. How are you as a staff using those things to reach your audience more often than just once a year? So, and the same is true if you're on a newspaper or if you publish a website. How are you getting to those readers? So let's take a look at some additional puzzle pieces that maybe you will need for those there. And there's 7 of those I came up with. We're going to go through these a little bit more with some examples, because I think these are very important to think about how you, let's see, which one? This one. Okay. So here are the puzzle pieces, I say, of good web reporting. And then again, this is how you tell a story online. First thing you got to think about here. The first one of the pieces is immediacy. And so the web is about telling stories that are happening right now. And that's why, for instance, when you have a website, you have to keep it updated regularly. The one thing we don't want to see is a website that's updated, once a month. That when your print newspaper comes out, let's say, that's not, you want to be reaching your audience much more often. The web also gives you the opportunity to cover breaking news, to tell people what's happening right now. And that's true, again, if you're on a yearbook staff or if you're on a newspaper staff. How do you reach people right now? So we think about the stuff that gets posted online, there's some sense of immediacy, what's happening right now. If you looked at, these are examples from last year when I put this presentation together, but these were things that were very immediate at the time. You were talking about differences with the virus and new updates that were happening. These were things also, these were this website, for instance, these were school announcements of things that were happening, different things, the way the school was responding to those things. So that, again, was a very immediate thing that people needed to know about. Next one of the puzzle pieces is you want to find interactive elements. And this is so important that readers online, they want to be able to click, they want to comment, they want to discuss, they want to sort of interact with what they're seeing. They don't just want to see text with photos accompanying it. That's sort of a baseline of coverage. And too often what we see is, students will post, they'll take what's in their print publication and they'll just dump it online and say, okay, I'm just going to print the same story online as I put it in print. And that's sort of not the way to do that. So you want to think about, how do you put elements like video and audio, and even things like, sound, timelines, anything that can be done to make that experience a lot more in depth and a lot richer for your audience. So that's something to think about. So how do you make things interactive? How do you give, a poll, for instance, or someplace where, they can get feedback? So again, here's a couple examples of that. Just doing a simple Q&A sometimes, showing slideshows from people, just like that. One of the things this staff does, they went and spent an hour in different classrooms, and they would just say, here's an hour in this medical class. They did an hour, in the band room or whatever, and just gathered those images and put some, I think, sound beds underneath them, and just said, what's it like to spend time there? Again, just video, trying to get tell a story with video. Don't just tell a story with words. So how can you be interactive? And again, that applies on your yearbook. It applies on your newspaper, etc. It's all the same thing. You just need to find ways to be interactive when you're doing those things online. Next one, we need to think about how we can be concise. And so remember, when you view websites, you're either you're in a hurry, or you might be looking at them on a mobile device. So you think about how you get, so because when you have a screen that's this big on your phone, you don't want to sit there. You may have to, you want to kind of get right to the point. So think about how you can be concise, how you can take that same story and give people quick bursts of information so that they can do that and then can also move on. So conciseness, I think, is more important in the online world than it is anywhere else. And again, you see things like this, there's just updates, general quick hits of information, give people what they need quickly. Sometimes you might do this with, I've seen some staffs where they write like a little summary of the story that appears at the top of the story, like in bold, just to give people those few extra sentences or a little summary. So that's one way to be concise. I think we need to find ways to have conversation online. This is the next element. They allow you to ask questions. This is a time when readers, again, want to be interactive. They want to do, they can sort of be part of the story. So for instance, that might be as simple as something of, posting something online and saying, hey, tell us how you spent your snow day. If you guys get snow days down there in Alabama, or at least not too often maybe, but, send us your pictures from prom. Tell us the stories you'd like to see. Ask them to give you tips. Ask them to tell you things. And let them be part of the conversation. Let them be part of the storytelling process, because that's something that gives more engagement. That's something where students will want to interact. And again, this applies very well to newspaper, yearbook, etc. When you have a website that accompany those mediums and social media as well. So think about ways you can ask people to participate in the storytelling process. It makes your job a lot easier too. Like, send us all these photos, and then we'll give you credit and show off their work, and makes your job easier because you don't got to go out and get as many photos. So again, some ways we have conversation, through social media, through comment functions, through just discussion posts, etc. So the websites you have or the websites you might use enable those types of things. Okay. This is a really big one. I can't tell you how many websites I look at from student newsrooms where they don't have any links in their stories. You need to have hyperlinks, those things, those little highlighted text that lead you on to other information. So for instance, if you mention like the name of a business, hyperlink to that business's website. If you mention, saying, well, we covered this issue, last month or something, link to that story. Links open up so much more possibility about where you can give people information, about where you can give people context, about, and so much more than you can in print, because you have so much more room, but you're not doing it on that one page. You're sending them that information that's already out there. So make sure your stories have as many links as possible online. And again, that's something as simple as, you can say here, like it says they address questions about this executive order that was issued. You see, the airport administration that's some link that tells you more information about that, shows you, they send you to Twitter with some pictures. So again, add links to wherever you can. And also, like I kind of mentioned this already, you want to make sure you have little summaries and little headlines on your website. And these are more important than I think anywhere else, because this is where you're going to draw your reader's eye. You're going to look at things. Readers are going to decide, do I want to click through this story? They don't even see the whole story. They got to decide, do I want to click this to get to the inside page, to click this other page to get to your story? So think about ways you can put more information and make more information available there. So if we take a look at this example, you see these headlines, and then sometimes they have these little summaries above the story here. Those are very important online. You need to spend time thinking about what you're going to put there. And sometimes I think maybe these just parrot whatever's in the lead. But think about, is there something else you want to include? Is there something better that might, you might set up a really good narrative lead in your story, but maybe, you need something like a more summary lead on something like this so that people can get information more quickly. And then finally, again, we talk about getting people that visual engagement. Think about bullets and subheads. You want to give information in smaller doses so that you can attract the reader's eye. And you also want to break up those long chunks of text, because you don't want to see long chunks of text on your website. And so for instance, something like this, they break down into a timeline, just something to break up all those visuals and break up all that text. That's very important. Those examples, by the way, were from southwestshadow.com and fhntoday.com. And those are two very excellent student news websites. So I would encourage you to check those out if you need some inspiration. Do that. But does anybody have any questions so far about some of those? I know we went through those really quick, and if we had a longer time, I would do things a little differently. But any questions so far about that? You can unmute yourself or throw them in the chat if you do. Okay, so, all right. So let's think here for a moment about what we're going to do about how we put all these puzzle pieces together then. And so do most of your staffs have some web presence so far? Right? How many of you have any social media presence? You guys are quiet. Okay, well, think about it this way. Sometimes you got to think about, when you take all these things together, how do you tell the same story in different ways? How do you take the same story and think about what's the immediate story that we have right now for the web, but what's also the print story 4 weeks from now? What's the yearbook story going to be next spring? How do you put all those elements together, and sort of how do you package those in one place? Or how do you tell those stories across different platforms? So that's something that we need to think about. So we think about different ways that we put all these puzzle pieces together. We think about, what sort of the values in some of these things are. So for instance, when we have a print story, we have a lot more room for depth and analysis or explanation. We can include a lot more description usually. And so, like, a lot of times also you're going to rely, especially because your print publications don't come out as often, whether it's a newspaper that's every couple of weeks or whether it's a yearbook that's once a year, you're going to rely a lot more on good feature stories and approaches. And also remember that print, in some respects creates a sort of more permanent record. People are going to hold on to that yearbook a lot longer than they might some other things. The newspaper or the magazine, somewhat, depending, they might save some of them, but again, there's something a little bit more permanent there. The web, as we said, we're going to emphasize interactivity, we're going to emphasize timeliness. And so, but the web is also made a lot more for sort of as readers are kind of seeking, they're scanning, they want instant information, they want up-to-date information. But the web also gives us, like we said, more conversation. It gives us more opportunity for ways we just gives us more opportunity to interact with readers and also interact with the content. And finally, even with social media, we're relying even more on immediacy than we do even on the web. You also need really good visuals, really good engagement. How do we get those Facebook posts, people to take them, or how to get them to engage with them, to actually stop and click on them and click through and use them. Also, you got to think about, you have different channels, whether that's Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram. Think about, the approach you're going to take on each one of them might be a little bit different. There's not a one size fits all. You're going to do everything the same on every one of them. It's like some of them are really good for, breaking certain, like breaking news and telling people up-to-date information. Some of them are better at some are better at looking for sources when you post things and say, send us your story ideas or send us your pictures, etc. So again, each one of them is going to be a little bit different. And it all comes back to how your audience is using them. If your audience is, you got to think about how they want to receive information. There's ways to use them well to do that, but you got to think about how are we going to do that. So you need to just keep those things in mind as you're doing that. And as I mentioned over here, you got to think platform first. If something happens today, what's the story we're going to tell on the web right now? What's the story we're going to tell on social media this afternoon? What's the story, though, we're going to think about in a few months or in a few weeks with our yearbook or with our newspaper? So that same message has to be tailored for each platform. So you can't tell the same story on the web today that you're going to tell in the newspaper 3 weeks from now. So you got to think about what's the different angle. Um, so, but also the big thing to remember here, all forms of your writing requires some sort of planning and some sort of purpose. You've got to have that focus and purpose for every piece of writing you have, or every story that you're going to tell. So let's think about here, a few minutes that we've got. Let's take a minute. So we've got 3 scenarios down here. So I'll kind of go through these and we can kind of talk about them a little bit. So it says your school's girls basketball team will play in the state championship this weekend. And the last time they won the championship was more than 60 years ago. Beginning next school year, a select number of students in your school will be selected to participate in a medical training program in coordination with a local hospital. Curriculum will be geared for those who want to enter the medical profession, and students will shadow doctors and other hospital staff. The announcement was made today or this afternoon during a joint press conference between your school and hospital administration. And finally, a tornado touches down in your community. Damage is contained to a small area, but it's fairly severe in spots. So take a quick minute here and think about some of those. And how would we tell those stories differently in print, on the web, and also with social media? How do we use all those things? Anybody want to throw out any ideas here that come to mind immediately?
I guess for the first one, the best way would be through like social media, explaining how we're going to the state championship, guys. We ain't been here to come to show school spirit.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, you're starting off thinking about what's the story right now. So if the game is this weekend, okay, or even tomorrow, quote unquote, there's a story now. There's an anticipation story. And if your newspaper isn't going to come out for 3 weeks, obviously you can't tell that anticipation story there. You got to do it now. So you got to think about social media. You got to think also about, they're going to play the game, but they could either win or they could lose. And so you got to think about, how do we tell what's the next iteration of the story? So, like, for instance, how are you going to use the website perhaps to do game coverage, for instance? How are you going to do that on social media as well? How many people are you going to devote to doing that? Are these the types of conversations you guys have right now, or is this kind of new to you guys to think about this kind of stuff?
It's pretty new to me. This is my
Okay.
first time broadcasting, so it's pretty
Okay.
new to me.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, and like I said, and the good thing about social media type stuff, it applies to whichever medium you're using. You can always take advantage of these things. So okay, so think about that. How you would tell that story in different ways. Kind of in the interest of time here, we'll kind of jump around a little bit. What's the thing, for instance, here with this medical program? Anything stand out to you guys, like how you would cover that press conference, for instance, that's happening today, right now? Well, think about here again, this is an immediate event. This is something, there's a new announcement. That's the perfect place to use something like your social media. That's the place to use the website. But think about, again, if you had, whether it's a broadcast show that comes out next week, whether it's a newspaper in 3 weeks or whatever, how are you thinking about the different story? You'll have more time to interview more people, to find out more information. And so you'll have a very different story as time goes along. And finally, with a tornado or any other sort of immediate weather disaster or fire or whatever, anything like that, you you can think about, think about what information people need right now. When I do this exercise in other contexts, students always come up with things like, where can people go to get help? Where can people go to find, if they need food or supplies or they need medical care, etc. That's the story right now. That's the immediate. We post that on social media. We post that on the website. But think about all the things we can do as the weeks go on, about how that story might change or might be different, and how we tell that story, and sort of create some permanent record of it in your yearbook or your newspaper or in your broadcast. So those are just some different thoughts about some of those. So does anybody have any last minute questions? I know we kind of got to wrap up, and I went through this way quicker than I normally would in many other places, but any questions from you guys?
When you were talking about the puzzle pieces, if you were to skip one, like if you were just not to include it, do you think the article or the video would be as effective if you did include it?
Well, yeah, I think that's situational. It depends. And honestly, for instance, you may not, especially for like those, like if you're looking at the ones that are on the web, I mean, no, like if you skipped, for instance, like, and you say like you didn't use any bullets or headlines or something like that, or like bullets and summaries, like, no, I think you'd be okay probably. Like every story doesn't have to have every single thing. I think if you go back to those first ones, those red ones, these are a little bit more like, these are just sort of things that you would include. These are sort of like the basic pieces when you put a news story or a news package together, whether it's there. I mean, obviously you need a focus. Everything you have to has to have focus. We need to talk to people. We need to hear from people as much as we can. There are times like if you write a really short news brief, maybe you say, well, we just got like a press release or something, and you can just attribute to that if you're writing a couple sentences to get it together. But generally, you need sources, you need people in your stories. And with all these things, we need to transition from one point to the next. We need to attribute our sources to people. So those are a little bit more important, but those are also a little bit more, those are just sort of the common things you would find. I came up with this list from just looking at stories and thinking, what are the parts of the story basically. So those are just kind of baked in there. So does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Anything else as we wrap up? All right. Well, that's that. So that brings us to almost 2:30, and I know you guys have other sessions, and I have some other sessions later this afternoon. So I will catch you guys later. So thank you all very much. Have a good day.
Have a good day.
Thanks.